Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Museum After Hours, our monthly lecture series. I'm Trey Johnson, and tonight we are joined by Beverly Buller. Buller's an author, educator, and chair of the William Allen White Children's Book Awards Selection Committee. Her two books about William Allen White and his family received Kansas Notable Book designations. Tonight's presentation, A Real American Goes Hunting, examines how 100 years ago, William Allen White mounted a 6-week campaign for governor as an independent to provide Kansas voters a candidate free from Klan influence. Buller will follow White's campaign across Kansas, where he delivered 104 speeches, all directed at expelling the KKK. Although he didn't win, White's efforts led to a Kansas Supreme Court ruling that outlawed the Klan in Kansas. We'll have a brief question and answer period after the program, so be sure to enter those questions into the Q&A feature or the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So with that, I am pleased to welcome Beverly Buller to the program.
Hello, I'm very thankful to be here and very glad that we have some people listening at this time and probably more later.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Let me get your PowerPoint up here. Give me one moment. All right, how does that look for you?
That looks fine.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will let you take it away.
All right, I am happy to do so. Thank you. The interesting thing when you think about William Allen White, who was a Kansas newspaper owner and editor and publisher, running for political office, is the fact that when he wrote his very first editorial as editor, owner, and publisher of the Emporia Gazette, he stated very clearly, I seek no political office. And yet here he was in 1924 running for governor. He fought a courageous 3-month, 6-week battle against the Klan in his beloved state of Kansas. Newspapers from all over, including outside of the United States, followed him because Kansas was not the only American state having trouble with the invasion of the Klan in the 1920s. The title for my talk and this political cartoon is a good example of what outsiders saw. Mr. White did not own a rifle, for example, certainly was not seen running too often, but he most certainly did run the Klan out of Kansas. This newspaper cartoon was in the New York World, and it was done by a man named Roland Kirby. And 100 years ago, there is no doubt that Mr. White saved our state from being overrun by the Klan, as had happened in many other states. Tonight, or whenever you're watching this, I am happy to tell you how he did it and why he did it. Okay, next slide. In 1924, Mr. White had had a busy few years. He was 53 years old in 1921 when the Klan first made an appearance in Kansas. He already had a very busy life. This is his desk in Colorado. You can look at all of his papers. He was a very busy man. He did not need another job. He had a full life. And he had, and I think this is a really important thing about him, he had several models for racial equality and social justice that I think led him to decide to run for governor. The years leading up to 1924 for him were very eventful. Next slide. Mr. White had a mother who was an Irish woman, Mary Ann Hatton, and she must have been an amazing woman, not real tall, because as you know, and many of you know, Mr. White was not a large man, tall man, but she had been a public school teacher and in Council Grove, Kansas, in a one-room schoolhouse before she met and married Allen White. Her first day of school, she was aware that she had an assortment of children and they were all different colors. She didn't care. She was there to educate. But by the end of the day, the town was in an uproar and the school was closed until she agreed to educate only white children. Well, she did not agree. So she left Council Grove, and within the year had met Alan White. Within that year had gotten married, and then within a year had little Will. And back then you did not teach if you had children. But she had made, I think, a powerful statement. An attorney later, or actually during that time she was meeting Alan White, an attorney went to bat for her, and she could have had her job back, but she had moved on. But I think her personality and her beliefs, she was back then a staunch Republican. She had seen Lincoln debating Douglas when she was in college. So she came from a real interesting past, and I think brought a lot of that to bear on her son. And then more recently, William Allen White and his wife had lost their daughter, Mary. She died in 1921 in a horseback accident. He wrote a wonderful editorial about her, for which he won no prizes, but it's probably the most famous thing that he has written. And Mary, in her last year of life, had started a petition at Emporia High School for Black girls to be able to have, this is 1921, separate but equal facilities. They did not have a lounge where they could go between classes, after school, before school, that type of thing. And she would have been happy to share with them, but she realized that most girls wouldn't. But at the time of her death in May of 1921, she was a junior. The lounge had not happened, but that was one way that the Whites were able to memorialize her, was to get a lounge for her Black classmates, female classmates. And that lounge eventually was dismantled, but it did serve its purpose in the way that Mary had realistically wanted. So he had these two ladies, I feel like, both in heaven by the time he started his campaign. His mother had died in May of 1924, and he started his campaign in September. So I think he felt like these ladies were looking over his shoulder. And his wife was a formidable woman also. Another thing that I feel influenced him, he had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1923 for an editorial that he had written on free speech. He was coming out of his involvement as a newspaper editor and owner with the Shopman's Railroad strike in 1922, I think it was. And this editorial was published. It's based on a letter he actually wrote to an anxious friend. He had already written books. He knew people all over the United States. He was well known in 1924. But I feel like having received this major prize had to have given him some confidence to go into what he decided to go into in the fall of 1924. Next slide. The Klan began to enter Kansas in 1921. That's this newspaper article, Ku Klux Klan enters Kansas. That was in 1921. And it says that they were actively setting up groups in central and mainly the southeast part of Kansas, because in that corner there. And they were being monitored by Governor Allen when this happened. Well, Governor Allen and William Allen White were very good friends. And really all of the newspaper people knew each other back then. And they were all kind of talking, okay, what are we going to do? So this editorial, from which I have an excerpt, was published. Well, it actually was a letter, and then he did this often. He recycled it and made it into an editorial. But this editorial is stating that there was an organizer in Emporia, because that's what they would do. The Klan would send organizer, one or two men, out to try to set up groups. And Mr. White is thrilled that the men were invited to join his band at $10 per join, and they turned him down. And he wrote, "It is to the everlasting credit of Emporia that the organizer found no suckers here." And of course, he says that should prove what a cheap screw outfit the Klan is. Now, unfortunately, he had to go back on this because the Klan was more successful within the next few months. But he realized right away the attitude that he was going to take toward the Klan in his newspaper was that he was going to laugh the Klan out of Kansas. So calling him a cheap screw outfit was kind of his opening shot toward the Klan. Okay, next slide. Now, the Klan rapidly made inroads. Here they are coming to Topeka. A branch has been formed in Governor's hometown, operating in 9 towns. Now, this was in the Topeka State Journal in 1921, around the time that Mr. White had the editorial I just showed you. And the article went on to say that 9 cities in Kansas in August of 1921 have clans in their town. And they are Wichita, Hutchinson, Ark City, Marion, Columbus, Independence, Pittsburgh, El Dorado, and Augusta. So, as we said earlier, it's truly central and southeast Kansas where they are moving in. Now, a little bit about the Klan, if I could have my next slide. The Klan of the 1920s had some things in common with the Klan of old, but if you will look at the things that are listed on this card, you'll see where they're going in the 1920s. They still talk about white supremacy, protection of our pure womanhood, and then the close relationship of pure Americanism. But now they want freedom of speech and press. They want a closer relationship between capital and American labor. They want to prevent the causes of violence and lynchings. They want to prevent unwarranted strikes by foreign labor agitators. And mainly, they want to limit foreign immigration. What you're looking at here was a card, not real big at all. And this would have obviously been given to anyone who came to one of their meetings. And obviously, if they decide they wanted to join, if they were a real man, as it says, they could put their name and their address and turn this card in at the end of the meeting. And then, of course, they would be contacted. They could put forth their $10 for their uniform, which, by the way, came from Atlanta. But what I find interesting about this is they want to know the occupation of people. And I think the reason for that is they prided themselves on having lawyers and even judges, teachers, doctors, dentists, professional people, as well as the labor people that they talk about. So that was kind of interesting. And this is just a card that was in an archive. Now, my next slide. Okay, yeah, this is actually an ad. And if you'll notice, it came from the Emporia Gazette. Mr. White was wanting to be equal, treat everyone equally. So he allowed all sorts of things in his paper. And this looks different. But if you take a minute and read it, it's the same sort of thing. And you could have cut this out and I suppose mailed it in or taken it to a meeting. And of course, they claim Emporia now has over 300 of its best men numbered in this membership. And see, they do have an address where it's a post office box. You could mail it. And they also have pretty much those same things listed there that they're going to protect people against and support, including limitation of foreign immigration and white supremacy. And they want to know your occupation. Okay, my next slide will show how the Klan moved across our state in the 20s. There was a lot of organizing going on in 1922 from the east part of the state to the west. Here in Fort Scott, 1922, they're initiating. Now, in Fort Scott, they did not actually have an established chapter in September of 1922. So the article says they're going to hold an initiation ceremony in Pittsburgh. And of course, they would have these out in cow pastures and people would circle their cars and turn their lights on, and then they would be out there in the middle. So, and eventually, of course, a chapter was set up in Fort Scott. And then the other articles from the Goodland paper about a month later, and the Klan is organizing out in Goodland. And this article mentions that the Klan has been in Kansas for pardon me, the Kansas has been in the process of organization. Eastern Kansas has been in the process of organization for many months, and at the present time 9 northwestern Kansas counties are being organized. Colby already has a branch. So 1922, it's marching across our state. Our next slide will show you what's going on 2 years later, or year and a half later. By 1924, when Mr. White made his decision to run for governor, the Klan was firmly entrenched. Here in the Lawrence Democrat in September of 1924, they're having an all-day session in the Opera House on a Sunday. They mention a convention being held in Kansas City, and the Imperial Wizard even attended. Then this other article was kind of interesting. McPherson County, which is McPherson, Kansas, that's central Kansas. Supposedly they're having what is being advertised as the first 4th of July celebration ever staged in Kansas by the Ku Klux Klan, being held at the fairgrounds. And you will see, I believe I have some other ads, because 4th of July, I mean, that was their big thing because they were purely American. So they would have a big 4th of July meeting, celebration. This one even had a parade with it. So by 1924, they're meeting in the nicest places and the nicest towns as well. Okay, next slide. This shows something that if you would take, and some of you listening to me maybe have studied the history of the Klan and some of the newspapers and what you see, the Klan of 1920s was very big on being a charitable and benevolent organization. So the newspapers are, and this is free publicity for them. They get all kinds of, you'll read all kinds of articles like these. Here in Olathe, they've given $63 to the boys. No, pardon me. Well, they probably did give some money toward the $63, but they're giving the Boy Scouts an American flag, and their leader gave a short talk. Wasn't that nice? And then this is really interesting. This is in 1922, a year earlier than the Olathe incident. And of course, just look at the headline: Ku Klux Klan gives Wichita Hospital a big cash gift. This is 1922. They have given Wesley Hospital in Wichita authorities a check for $8,100 and a letter saying the amount would be increased to $10,000 by Sunday night. So, I mean, like I said, they're meeting in the nicest places and being as involved as they can. Our next slide will show that Mr. White, once again, was trying to be fair. This is a letter to the editor, and as you know, they print those. You simply have to identify or to approve you are who you say you are. So here is a letter also from 1922 where they've been especially liberal in their donation of $51.60 to a family who is in need of assistance. And of course, at the end, the gentleman says, "May God bless the Ku Klux Klan, and the people praise them for all the good things they are doing." This is one of many stories like this. They're giving a little girl some money to go to college. They're buying a lady some dresses who had a fire in her home. And of course, there were women's branches of the Klan. So they were probably the ones that were buying this lady dresses. But the papers, not just in Kansas, but everywhere, are full of this type of letter to the editor and article about the generosity of the Klan. And this last one, I always include this one because it's one of the more humorous ones. It's not the only one that I've seen, this article. Okay, next slide. The headline tells the story. I bet a lot of you are chuckling. And like I said, this is in Winfield, Kansas, but Santa, KKK Santa, visited many towns and brought candy for the children. This one is interesting. If you look at the date, this is December 23rd of 1924. So the election is over. The Klan is still allowed to meet in our state, but the election is over. And this particular article mentions colored children as well as white are invited. And I've seen things like this in the papers too, where they will invite, as they call them, colored people to come to their events and to come watch their parade or whatever. So my point being that they worked very hard to be seen as a benevolent organization, an important organization in our state, one that we would want. All right, I'm not an expert on the Klan. That's all I have to say about them. So next, I want to talk just a little bit about Henry Allen. Henry Allen started all of this because he was governor of Kansas from 1919 to 1923, and he saw the Klan making inroads in Kansas, and it was his choice to start documenting them, investigating them, and whenever he could, taking action against them. And as I mentioned, White and Allen were very good friends. Mr. Allen was the owner of the Wichita Beacon. White and Allen and their families had traveled together. In fact, in 1918, Mr. Allen and Mr. White traveled to France together to observe wartime conditions for the Red Cross. And Mr. White got a book out of it called The Martial Adventures of Henry and Me. So I really feel that I can't talk about what Mr. White did without recognizing Mr. Allen, who I feel was always behind him, checking in with him, and vice versa. I'm sure he was talking to Henry and saying, what did you find out? What are you doing now? Okay, next slide. One thing that Mr. Allen found out is you can't stop the Ku Klux Klan. Now, see, this is July of 1921. This is early in their time coming into our state. And the bottom line here is almost the bottom line of the article. The governor said there is no Kansas statute which would prevent organization of the order, and that state officials would interfere only if acts of violence are committed. So this is what Mr. Allen and his attorney general began really watching. They started taking names of people whenever they could, trying to come up with a list of everyone that was in the Klan and trying to find legal ways for stopping them. So state officials can only intervene if there's acts of violence. And I read one article where the Klan had said, we don't intimidate people, we persuade them. Well, sometimes the two are synonymous. So they were really White too, but Allen and his attorney general were really watching for any acts of violence. And then in the meantime, he was going to do whatever he could to maybe not stop the Klan right away, but at least slow them down a little. So my next slide, the headline's kind of funny since we've all lived through the pandemic, but this was a way that he was able to slow them down. This was in July of 1922. This article was published in the Arkansas City paper because the Klan was planning a big parade. And as many of you know, even their horses wore sheets with masks. So Governor Allen just barred mask wearing. You cannot wear black or white masks. And he said, I think all of us know that the only reason you would want to wear a mask in public is if you were going to rob someone. So this was just something that he could do to slow them down. And not everyone paid attention to him, but the Ark City Klan canceled their July, and this was after the 4th of July, but they canceled their July parade. Okay, the next slide, as I mentioned, not everyone paid attention. This happened in Topeka. Topeka went ahead and let them march in their hoods. And it says that the mayor changed his mind at the last time and permitted the Klan to parade the streets of Topeka wearing their masks. Attorney General Griffith maintained to the last that a parade of masked men should be prevented, but the governor and the mayor were too many for him. So, yeah, but like I said, there was nothing really legally, that he could do at that time. Next slide. Something else that Allen and whoever his attorney general was at the time were watching were these statements that the Klan was making. Look at the bottom article, at the very bottom. This is from the McLouth Times in November of 1922. The Klan hasn't even been in our state that long, and yet they're putting this article in the local paper, and at the very bottom it says incorporated. Yeah, they were doing business in Kansas. They were selling the uniforms and all kinds of things, but they did not have a charter. Regardless of what this article from the Holton Recorder in September 1923 says, they did not have a charter to legally do business in Kansas. And evidently a Chamber of Commerce in Holton had given them a charter. Well, that's not going to stand in any state Supreme Court case or anything. So this was another way that they were looking at what can we do to get the Klan legally out of our state. All right, next slide. So the Attorney General continues investigating. And in November of 1922, an ouster is actually filed. And they're able to file this because those two things have happened. There has been violence. A Catholic mayor who lived in Liberty, Kansas, in Montgomery County, had been basically kidnapped and taken out in the country and whipped and beaten. But he said there were 13 masked men, and they called that civil disruption, violence, whatever. So they had that, and that was documented. And then, of course, they always kept saying they have a charter. Well, they don't. So that's how this ouster was filed. Now, this is in 1922. It doesn't happen overnight, but this was filed because Governor Allen and at this time, it was Attorney General Hopkins, were able to take action. Okay, next. This drags on. Here we are in 1923, Klan of Kansas makes defense. And the ouster process was started last summer by Hopkins, who was then Attorney General, who demanded the Klan comply with the law regarding issuance of charters for corporations acting or operating with the state. They really had thought that by Christmas of 1924, this would be settled, but it drug on, and the Klan did try to fight back and at one point applied for a charter, but they were not allowed. Eventually, they're legally not allowed. Okay, also in 1923, next slide, Mr. White was having, I told you he was going to laugh the Klan out of Kansas. So here are just some little snippets that are in the paper. He talks about them wearing white nighties or night shirts. Keep an eye on your night shirt. This is the flavor of coverage that he had in the paper. Early in 1923, White had one son, one child after Mary died, and he was at Harvard, and his name was William Lindsay White. People called him Bill. So I have read letters between the two, and at one point, Mr. White wrote to his son, "The KKK people seem to be having a grand old time, and we are having fun fighting them." So here's some examples of how they were having fun fighting them. And I've noticed some of the other papers in Kansas, generally, Mr. White did not capitalize Klan. Now, I notice all three of these do. If it was just him, he didn't even want them to be a proper noun. He would not capitalize them. But other newspapers picked up on this type of coverage, and you will find articles making fun of them in other papers as well. All right, next slide will show that Mr. White was not too worried about all this in 1923. He went on vacation to the Mediterranean with Victor Murdoch, another Wichita newspaperman, and his wife, and Sally White, Mr. White's wife, went along. This had been planned for some time. Also, Mr. White had a personality that if he did not take vacations, he would suffer from what they would call nervous prostration. He would just break down and could do nothing. So his wife probably was instrumental. And I imagine the Murdochs too saying, hey, you need to literally get out of the country. So he went on this vacation. And next slide, when he came back, not that this would have not happened if he were there, but he comes back to find Klan representatives in all of the major offices in Emporia, the mayor, the sheriff, and a stack of handbills shows up in the city office. They're meeting in some of the nicest places around town, and they're very open about it too. Now, the next slide, I want to share with you a kind of funny story. I mean, the newspapers tell some of it, but Mr. White had a man working for him named Frank Clough, and he wrote a book before Mr. White died. He wrote a book about working for Mr. White, whom he really respected. And he tells the story of the Broadview Hotel opening in September of 1923, and it was the nicest place in town. It was catty corner across the street. The building is still there, catty corner across the street from the Gazette. And Mr. White said, well, you know, they're full tonight. Let's find out who all's there. Well, Mr. White knew that a large portion of the people that were there that night or staying there was because of a Klan convention. And he wanted those names. I mentioned the governor was collecting names, and so was the attorney general. So Mr. Clough says in the book that he went and asked for the register. And of course, even in 1922 or 23, sorry, was told no. So according to the book, he went back to the Gazette, and Mr. White said, and I quote, he sent a letter, and the letter said this, and I quote, if a copy of the Broadview Hotel register for today is not in our office by 7 o'clock tonight, the name of the Broadview Hotel will never again be printed in the Gazette except in case of police raids and similar events. So here came Mr. Clough with the register. And this article, Full House at the Broadview, has all those names. Now, some of the names are from places like New York, St. Louis, that type of thing. Local people would know that there was a music convention, and people were even coming from out of the United States for this convention. So there were two conventions being housed, and Mr. White knew that local people would be able to pick out the Kansas people, separate them from the Chicago, the New York, etc. people. So there's that. He published that. Well, then just a couple of nights later, oops, I need to go back to that slide. Sorry. A couple of nights later, we get full up. Last night, the Broadview Hotel had to turn away guests for the first time since it opened. The KKK District Convention did it. Well, Mr. Clough said, Mr. White, why are you praising them? Why are you giving them an article in the paper? And he said, well, it's kind of like, you know, when you spank a child, you have to give them some candy later. So this was the candy for the KKK. And of course, he fits in that the Knights of Columbus is having a state meeting later. Okay, now next slide. Okay, the 1924 primary is starting to come together. And as this headline says, Paulin and Davis seem to be nominated. Capper, of course, was running. But what I like about this particular article, this is an early article, August of 1924, and it actually says down there at the bottom, Fredonia Banker and Ku Klux Klan in Dorsey. That's referring to Paulin. Now, Davis was the incumbent and running again. And he would supposedly, from what I've read, not comment. If he was asked, well, so are you a Klan member? I know you have been. Well, no, he would not say anything. Paulin, if asked, would say, not at this time. So Mr. White knew that, everyone knew that both men had at one time been associated with the Klan. And here this article in the Haviland Review is coming right out and saying that the Klan endorsed Paulin. So this is what is lining up in August of 1924. Mr. White began, well, he already was before August, every Allen and White and all of them were asking, won't you run again? Or won't you run for governor? Nobody would do it. And next slide. We have these two candidates, and Mr. White began to notice, next slide, that Ben Paulin, the ads for him in Emporia at least, were showing up in the windows of the businesses that Mr. White knew to be owned by Klan members. So I think probably every time he saw one of these ads in one of these merchant windows, it just frustrated the heck out of him. So next slide. On September 20, 1924, Mr. White, who said he would never run for political office, he didn't want to, he threw his hat into the ring saying, I want to be governor to free Kansas from the disgrace of the Ku Klux Klan. And I want to offer Kansans afraid of the Klan and ashamed of that disgrace a candidate who shares their fear and shame. He wants to give them a choice. Now, in order to run as an independent, Mr. White had to send around a petition, and he needed 2,500 signatures on that petition. He made a point, and I believe he started the petition around September 10th, but he made the point of not sending it anywhere in Lyon County. He only sent it around, well, it probably went all over the place, but he did not get any of the names from Lyon County. Supposedly they were people that maybe did not know him, except everyone knew him back then. He got 10,000 signatures on his petition. And he had this flyer. White announces, you can see the quote I just read is from that. He had that ready to go. So that went out to newspapers, probably from sea to shining sea, because he wanted everyone to know what he was doing. He was running for a principle, not for an office. Okay, next slide. And because Mr. White had sent that announcement out and probably a few press releases as well, the nation started watching right away. This article from a Salisbury, Maryland paper was published September 20, 1924. It was published the day that he announced. And then here's the Buffalo, New York Courier. The New York Times loved watching him. They even sent a reporter. A reporter came from a London newspaper to kind of report on this little heavy-set, middle-aged man who was running for governor. And also Colorado, and I'm sure other states too, but Colorado was really starting to be overrun by the Klan. And they even reached out to White and said, please help. We're watching you. You know, if you're successful, we're going to do whatever Kansas does. So the nation was definitely watching. Okay, next slide. Mr. White had a campaign to run, and he came up with a list of towns that he wanted to visit, and he chose to start in Cottonwood Falls, Kansas on September 19, I believe it was. And his first speech was to have been held in the courtroom at 8 o'clock. No, September 22nd, sorry. The article on the other side mentions that because of the crowd, does it say the number? There were from 400 to 500 in the audience. So they could not hold it in the courtroom as planned. So if many of you know Cottonwood Falls, the beautiful courthouse, he spoke on the steps of that courthouse, and all the people stood out on the street in front of him. And supposedly 400 to 500 people. Remember that number. I believe I have an article that now says there were a lot more than that. You never know. After that, he visited these towns in the next 5 days: Beloit, Concordia, Salina, Harrington, and Abilene, Bonner Springs, and he ended in Topeka on a Saturday. Now, in order for him to do this, he would simply stay with friends. And sometimes those friends were the newspaper editor in the town. And I'm sure they were all happy to host him, happy to feed him. He did not drive. So he had his son came and drove, his wife came along sometimes, but he just kind of went from here to there. And his early speeches were simply the Klan. We got to get rid of the Klan. That was his entire platform in these early speeches. Okay, the next slide, the next couple slides are some places that he got to visit. Some of the cities really had a chance to advertise. This little flyer, which actually is bigger than this, was put on car windows in the Concordia, Kansas area because Mr. Brown was going to be speaking at their Grand Theater up there in Concordia. And that was on September 23rd. Okay, and then next, on September 25th, he got to speak at the courthouse in Council Grove. And that must have been very meaningful to him because, as you know, his mother had quite a history in Council Grove. And here he was also fighting for the rights of everyone. Okay, and then I have the next slide, just some little examples of newspaper coverage. Here he is speaking in the courthouse at Marysville. Mr. White's one of the big men of Kansas. And then the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Evening News was reporting that he had done a talk. He renewed his attack on the Klan in the second week. And then Allen County Journal reports that a large number of citizens in Iola drove down to Humboldt to hear him. It's reported the hall was so crowded that not more than half of those who wanted to hear Mr. White could do so. And then the Lynchburg paper was a little bit more middle of the road in their coverage. They said a large number of voters went to McPherson Friday evening to hear William Allen White. And in this respect, as in everything else, some were pleased and others were not. And you might remember that by 1924, McPherson would have had a large Klan membership. So I'm sure some were not pleased. Okay, the next slide. If we need further proof that the press was watching, the nation was watching William Allen White, here he is on the cover of Time magazine less than a month before the election. He was being watched and he was being praised by the media very much. Okay, the next slide. I mentioned that Mr. White had a platform primarily of anti-Klan. You know, we do not want the Klan. And he said he one time he said, if the Klan wins, they will change the name from Kansas to Klansas. And of course, this ad came out. This came out just days before the election, and he has a platform. And these are things that he personally was interested in. He also lists his lieutenant governor, and he has another slate of people that are running, which I'll show you another ad here in a second. And, you know, down at the bottom, it says, shall the Ku Klux Klan name the next governor of Kansas? I mean, he's getting right to the point. And this is when here that cartoon shows up. He begins to use the cartoon from the New York World. White is right, help him fight. So now the next slide will show, this is the other ads I wanted to show you. This one, William Allen White for governor. I've drawn an arrow because this is one of the most important things at this point in his campaign. It's just days before the election. And here he has listed the people. It's him, it's his lieutenant governor, his secretary of state, Attorney General Griffith, who's running for re-election, and Jess Miley, superintendent of public schools. Every time he talked, he would say, please, folks, you've got to vote for these people. Frank Ryan was even a Catholic, and so he was very invested in getting the Klan out of Kansas. Over on the other side here, William Allen White, anti-Klan candidate for governor, November 1st, Saturday. This was pretty much his last, well, this was his last out of town junket that he did. And notice he was 53 years old, 56 years old, and he's speaking at the Stockyards at 11, Cudahy packing at noon, Dole packing at 12:15, and the Wichita Forum at 8 p.m. So, you know, he really poured it on there at the end. But please remember those names, Griffith and Ryan especially. If they get reelected, that's going to be a very good thing for anti-Klan people in our state. Okay, next slide. When I wrote my book, my biography of William Allen White, clear back in 2007, called From Emporia, I had mentioned to my editor, the book was published by Kansas City Star Books, which is no longer in existence, but I had mentioned to my editor, God, I wish we had a picture of him campaigning. I've heard one tape of that somebody recorded him, and I have it got it on cassette, and he was not a particularly wonderful speaker, although he did speak in the style of his day. And so when my editor brought me the galley of the book to look over, in the chapter where I talk about him running for governor, here's this picture, and it looks like he's on someone's back porch. I was thrilled to death to have that picture. I also was aware that during this campaign, he had done a speech to the League of Women Voters up in Kansas City. And I found this other picture of him surrounded by ladies in the Emporia State Archives. And I'm pretty sure that that's probably where that came from. So here are two campaigning photos of Mr. White. And the next slide, when it was all said and done, Mr. White had traveled 2,783 miles in the 6 weeks that he was running. He gave 104 speeches. He spent $474.60 on his campaign. He would get $25 out of the bank every Monday morning. So he had some spending money. When he around town, he never carried money. He just said, oh, put it on my tab. Well, you can't do that when you're traveling around the state. So he would get $25 cash out of the bank every Monday, and that would get him around. This picture is him with the Dodge car in which he traveled. Ann O'Hare McCormick of the New York Times was the reporter that came to Kansas, and she described him as, quote, a stout little Don Quixote riding in a Ford and chuckling as he went. I'm sure, I don't know cars, but they had a Dodge at the time Mary died. So that's probably a Dodge. But anyway, the point is there that he was a stout little Don Quixote. And as you can see, he had a very small campaign staff. I'm sure everyone on the Gazette helped him, but he did have one gentleman that arranged his speaking arrangements. Okay, next slide. It's now time for the election. The night before the election, this article, or this little note appeared in the paper from Mr. White. And he says at the bottom, for the first time, I ask for myself, will you please vote for me? It was a very personal and heartfelt request. And I think by that time, at the end of the 6 weeks, he probably was, very excited about all this. He never wanted to win, but I think, he was probably on a little bit of a high. He did give speeches in Emporia that night. I believe he gave two that night. And then when he came home, there were some reporters for the Kansas City Star. Well, he used to work for them. And he supposedly said to them, and I quote, he told this to a Star reporter, you can't watch me because I'm going to bed. I have made my fight for what I believe, and I'm tired, and I'm going to sleep in my own bed. All right, next slide. The next morning, the story was told. No one was surprised. Paulin did win, and White came in last. But you know what? It was respectable. I think a lot of his friends did not even think he would get that many votes. Mr. White once said, if Mr. Paulin wins, the state motto will have to be changed to ad astra per cow pasture. Now, Mr. White knew he had to live with the choice of his voters. Okay, next slide. This little article appeared in a number of papers. I got this particular one from a Council Grove Republican the day after the election, and it's just a follow-up. And as it says, he asserts race for the governorship was undertaken as a matter of principle. And he said, I wanted to give people who were against the Klan a chance to vote for someone who felt as they felt. And I thought that was nice and good of him. Well, he's a newspaperman, but to send this press release out that, I'm a good sport about it. I did what I could do. And the best thing that happened, and he doesn't mention it here, but the people that he asked, the anti-Klan slate that he asked people to vote for, did get elected. Therefore, next slide. In July, in time for the 4th of July, 1925, no charter to Ku Klux Klan. The state Supreme Court ruled it is not a charitable or benevolent organization. All those articles I showed you meant nothing to the state Supreme Court. And Attorney General Griffith, who had been reelected, was able to prepare the opinion. Governor Paulson made no public objection to this and showed no favoritism from what I've read throughout his time as governor. And most importantly of all, and this did happen 100, well, it'll be happening 100 years ago next year, but Kansas was the first state to outlaw the Klan, to tell them they cannot do business in our state. And other states quickly followed what we had done. Now, next slide. The Klan slowly left the state. Just because the people that Mr. White had asked folks to vote for got elected, the legislature still had a lot of Klan sympathizers. So here in this came out the same day that the ruling was, it was announced, but it took a while for the Klan to leave our state. Attorney General W.A. Smith came along after Griffith, and he served until 1930. And in the early years, like 1926, 27, he was keeping a close eye on what the Klan was doing, because they did not have a charter and they should have left the state, and they did, or at least they went underground. You didn't hear about them in the papers. But here we are, 1925. Here's another one of these July 4th celebrations. This one is every bit as fancy as the one we heard about happening earlier for the first time in McPherson. And lunch is served by the Methodist ladies, it says. Also, I should mention that, I said that it took a while for the Klan to leave our state. In Newton, Kansas, a newspaper reported there was a Klan parade in August of 1927, but they did not wear masks or hoods. And in Wichita, in 1928, they openly marched in full regalia. And the article said that they knew that they shouldn't be doing it and that they didn't have a charter and they weren't allowed, but they did it anyway. So, they just kind of pushed the envelope for as long as they could. Okay, next slide. Mr. White's last words to the Klan were May 5th, 1926. And as I said, the Klan was still around. But as he says in this, I think he loved writing this editorial. You can find this online if you ever want to read all the crazy language in here. But as he says, by 1926, the Kluxers in Kansas are as dejected and sad as last year's bird's nest. And yeah, they're out of here, and he's done with them. Now, next slide. One thing I really enjoyed, I enjoyed so many things, and I've done so much research on Mr. White over the years, but I've so much enjoyed looking again at this scrapbook that his wife Sally had put together. And it's an old-fashioned large scrapbook that she has pasted in letters, newspaper articles, photos, etc. And one of the photos is him, and he's wearing the hat that you see him wearing in some of these pictures. And on the back, he has written, taken in 1924, the year I was running as independent candidate for governor against the Ku Klux Klan. So, he doesn't even say I'm running for governor. He says I'm running against the Klan. And another wonderful item is on the next slide. This is a letter that was sent at Christmas in 1924 from then President Calvin Coolidge. And, he has a signature on there, and he thanks Mr. White for his notable service to our country. He doesn't say specifically, thank you for taking 6 and more weeks out of your life to run for governor and make a point. But Mr. White got the point because down at the bottom is his own note. This was written at right after my campaign against the Ku Klux Klan, WAW. So he knew what the president meant and he accepted his thanks. And I think finally, yeah, I've got two more slides here. Next slide. Yeah, the blue one. People often ask me, don't you think he really wanted to be governor? Oh, no, it would not have suited his personality at all. He didn't have time. And here is a private letter. Of course, Mr. White by 1924 knew none of his letters were going to be private after he was gone. But here's a letter to Senator Charles Curtis, who, of course, went on to become our first Native American vice president. And he says, as a postscript, I hardly need to tell you, Charlie, that I didn't want to be governor, and I didn't expect to be at any stage of the campaign. I don't want any political office, elective or appointive. I just want my freedom, such as it is. So take that for what it's worth. I think he meant that, and knowing him the way I know him from all my research. And finally, I want to end with one more letter. Next slide. Mr. White would dictate a letter, and there would be things in it that he really liked. So he would have his secretary repackage and say, okay, I want you to send that to all these people and just simply change the salutation. I'll sign them all. So this is a quote from a letter to A.E. Holt about a week after the election. But I have two letters here. One of them is behind me here in my office that have this same sentiment, and it's good. But this is what he felt he had done. He said, the fact that I could get out and spit in the face of the Klan and had done it, had cleared up the atmosphere. I am very proud of it all. And that shows up in many, I mean, I've read 3 examples, but he did this with when Mary White died. He would send pretty much identical letters to people. Now, the letter I have above me here on my desk, he'll write, well, I guess he did it back here too, which you can't see, but it's back there. But he'll put a little personal note to the people to make it more personal, but it says the same things. And this is one of the things that he said a lot in his letters after he did not win the election, but he did clear up the atmosphere. While I have a captive audience, I have 2 more quick things I want to remind you of. Mr. White's home, for a long time, was our state's newest historic site. And it went from being a family home to being a state historic site starting in 2005. Now, most of the state historic sites are closed now for the winter, but they are open by appointment. I just found out they open April 16, 2025. But you can make appointments. If you have a small group and you'd like to tour Mr. White's home, most of the furnishings and items in there belong to the White family. His son and wife moved in there at one point after 1950. Sally died in 1950. So they moved in the 60s and 70s. So some of their things are there too, which makes it interesting. But appointments can be made. The website is out there. We're also having our annual White Christmas open house from 2 to 4, Sunday, December 8th at the site. Little tours will be given. We always have musicians or different people coming to entertain, and it costs nothing, which, by the way, the state historic sites cost nothing the last 2 years, which is very nice. So you might kind of put this in the back of your head. And Emporia is not a far drive from a lot of places here in Kansas. And we even have a lot of people in Emporia that have never been through this house. And it is interesting and very much a part of William Allen White's story. And I'll end with, I mentioned my book from Emporia. I wrote this when I was teaching middle school students. So I wrote it at an 8th grade reading level. I told my editor there needed to be photos on every page. Now, it might be a letter or it might be a report card. I do have those things in here, but I wanted it to be of interest to kids. they're even worse now, but kids don't want to read a full page of text. So I think we succeeded. I had a great team. My art editor made it very readable. I have had a lot of adults tell me I've read from Emporia because I couldn't bring myself to read his autobiography, which is so thick. And of course, I quote liberally from the autobiography and letters. You get a real sense of who Mr. White is. And I did a chapter on his daughter, Mary. No one had ever written a book about her. And when I would talk about Mr. White to students, especially, one time I had a gym full of middle school, they were fifth grade kids. And I was out there on the gym floor and they were in the bleachers, and you could have heard a pin drop when I was showing them a picture of Mary on her horse and telling the story. I mean, I had him in the palm of my hand. I'm a teacher, but I mean, it feels so wonderful when that happens. And I told my editor, Mary needs her own book. So A Prairie Peter Pan is the story of Mary White. I wrote it for younger kids. I wrote it at a second grade reading level. But I have a letter from a woman in her 80s that said how much she loved the book. And I'm not supposed to read children's books. Well, of course you are. A good book, a good children's book is good for any age. So these books would be in any library in our state because they get all the Kansas notable books and available at your favorite book vendor. And I think that completes my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Beverly. That was incredible. And thanks for the shout out to our William Allen White Red Rocks site. So be sure to make it to that special event. And I want everyone here to go check out those books and either pick them up from the library or get them wherever you purchase your books. To definitely dive deeper in. So we will open this up for questions here. And Beverly, I'll start this out. What got you interested in William Allen White? Was it the man himself, or was it the fight against the Klan?
Oh, it was definitely the man himself, because I was like many people in our state and had no idea that he had run for governor and why. That was something I discovered as I read his autobiography as an adult. But being a public school teacher, I had an English teacher and then a librarian. I had gotten to know Mr. White through his book award, which is how many children get to know him. That serves grades 3 through 8. I am the chairman of the selection committee for it, have been for years. So yes, I became, and the kids would ask, how did William Allen White write all the books on this list? And I would find myself explaining, well, he did write books, but he's been dead since 1944. So no, and that's
He's a
why I
busy
read the
guy.
autobiography. And then when I went to the grand opening of Red Rocks, I realized I talked to William Allen White's great grandson that day. And I said, do you realize your kids don't have a book about their great, great, great grandpa? He said, no. And I said, well, I'm going to write it. And you will have to allow me to give me permission to quote. Oh, yes, yes, whatever you need. So that's how it all started. But it was a desire to know more about him to tell my students.
Well, kind of, you talked about the Klan a lot, and you really kind of highlighted some of the absurdities of the group. And I this is something I've kind of always wondered about. What's the deal with the naming conventions? Because it's a weird juxtaposition between how silly the outfits, the names, the Grand Wizard, Grand
Yeah, the
Cyclops.
clavern. Yeah, everything's
It's
K.
yeah, and it's so
Yeah.
that's silly, but they're committing acts of domestic terrorism, which is
Yes.
very serious. So what
Yes.
what is up with this weird juxtaposition?
I really do not know. Like I said, I am not an expert at all on them. And I do not know, but that juxtaposition is certainly there. And I have not run across mention of this in our state. But if some of you listening may have read the wonderful book Fever in the Heartland, which follows Indiana being taken over by the Klan, and they had Ku Klux Kitties, as in children. I knew they had women, and we had women's groups, but they had Ku Klux Kitties out in Indiana. And see, that's what would have happened to our state if Mr. White had not done this, because it totally took them over. But yes, I wish I had an answer for that. Why do Shriners wear little hats and ride tricycles? I don't know. It makes them look approachable. I don't know.
Yeah. We have a question here from Norman. They say, I was somewhat surprised that multiple races showed up for school in Council Grove. Do you
Yes.
think that was common at the time? I always thought most schools only taught white children.
Yes, it must have been for Council Grove. I've done this talk in Council Grove, and I'm able to show them a photo of the little brown school where Marianne Hatton White taught. And what happened was they then built a school for Black children. I think maybe they just didn't know. And also, I think a lot of there weren't that many. I don't know for sure how many. There would not have been that many because there would not have been that many people of color in Council Grove back then. But I imagine they probably were all mixed race. And I always say we're all mixed race. I mean, I used to get so tan that I looked like I was an immigrant or something. But yeah, I do not know. I do not know. But I do know that they did build a school for, they called it Negro colored children in Council Grove within a few years after this happened. But yeah, I think maybe those children just wanted to be educated and they showed up. I don't know.
If what do you think William Allen White would say? We brought him to the 21st century today, and he learns that the Klan still exists. What do you think? What do you think he would say?
Well, I think he would say, look at what he would never say just but look at how we approached it. You know, we don't want them in our faces. We don't want them in public. And what they do, they often do under cover of darkness. And I think he would, I don't know, he might run for governor again. Who knows? You know, he would do whatever he needed to do to shine the spotlight on them. Like if they pop up, shine the spotlight, make them go away, make them go, because we know that they're still around, and the feeling, certainly the feeling, that card could be signed by any number of people nowadays that don't want form that do not want immigrants, that want to protect women, that want to that white supremacy is, you know, how they operate. Yeah. Yeah, I think he would speak out as he did before and do what he needed to do. Because of course, now I don't even want to get started on this, but it is very interesting. His next campaign, which started not too long after this one, was against Dr. Brinkley, the
Yes.
goat gland doctor. So if anyone watching is interested, that's a good story too. And
Yeah.
there's a good book to go with that one too.
Yes. Yeah.
And he made sure that Dr. Brinkley did not do any more business in Kansas. But it wasn't, once again, it wasn't just him. It was a large group of people that were doing it for the good of our state. Yeah,
Another.
that was his next campaign, was against Brinkley.
Yeah, and another fascinating governor campaign.
Oh yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, yeah, fantastic. Sometime we'll need to have a museum after hours just about Brinkley because yeah, what
Yes, yeah.
a fascinating guy. But another
That's
another
one way,
time.
that's one way to say it. Yes.
Um, well, we are out of time, but thank you, Beverly, so much
Thank you.
for your presentation. And remember, everybody here, go up and pick up those two books. Definitely, they're accessible for anybody, but definitely helping young readers is always something that's just fantastic. And I hope everyone here can join us next month, December 11th at 6:30 p.m. to hear Dr. Etta Fields Black present Harriet Tubman and the Combahee River Raid. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.